Okay, so we wanted to make a video for staff and students at DMU where gay members of staff and students talk about when they came out and why it was the best decision that they ever made.
When I was 15, a girl came to the small town Catholic secondary modern school that I went to. And she was like a breath of fresh air. She got long, dark, curly hair and long legs. And she was just so exciting and bubbly and energetic and so on. And I kind of think that for me it was something different. I had boyfriends at the time, but it was her I dreamed about. And when she told me 2 years later that her boyfriend wouldn't allow her to see me anymore because he didn't like our friendship, I was devastated. And I remember kind of moping around the house, and my dad, who never really noticed what I was feeling or anything, said, you're mourning her like a boyfriend. And I kind of think that was probably the first time that I ever thought that being homosexual I could understand why people would be. And it wasn't until I came to Leicester in the 80s that I began to think of myself as a lesbian, and I fell madly in love with a woman. But it wasn't until 6 years when our relationship ended that I told my folks, oh, my relationship's ended, and by the way, I'm a lesbian. It's never a good line. It's not the way to do it. I wouldn't say that's a way to come out to your parents, because there was just too much for them to deal with.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that anyone who's contemplating coming out, I mean, it's the best thing you'll ever do. I'm not really a person who has regrets, but I do regret the fact that I wasn't really out when I was at university. And I can remember very vividly the moment when I kind of came out, and I was terrified about the possibility for months, really. I'd actually graduated from university and I got my first job in Salford, and I discovered that there was an LGBT centre, I'm not sure if it was called that then, probably didn't have a T, but LGBT centre in Manchester, that I used to walk past, once a week, and I used to think, God, I've just got to go in there. I just can't live with the fact that I've created this sort of image of myself which isn't really me. It's not really authentic, very sort of honest. And I didn't want to live that life anymore. I can remember it really, really vividly. I went through the door, and I don't know what I was expecting, sort of people in tiaras, or someone was going to come up and snog me, or even worse, someone was going to sort of out me, and I was going to be on the front page of a new... I mean, it sounds so ridiculous now, but these are the kind of things that you sometimes think about. How would your friends react? You think about the list of friends you've got, and you try and think about the ones who've made homophobic comments in the past, or... But for me, it was a really, really big decision, and I'm so pleased that I took it. And I went, and of course, it was absolutely fantastic. They were, the people there knew how to deal with people like me. They knew how nervous and anxious I was going to be, and it just became a really fantastic social group. But then the next really big step was coming out to my parents, and I can remember this really vividly, and I told this story. I've just become the president of the local LGBT centre in Leicester. There's only 5 of these centres left in the UK now, and I think they do incredible work, and it's a tragedy really that one of the aspects of austerity is that there just aren't very many around anymore, because there's still a need for them. And I said to everybody, I said, okay, over here is my mum, and she's come to have a cup of tea with me in this lovely new flat, that my first home that I'd ever had for myself. And I did a really kind of gay thing when I bought this flat. I got a cat, and it was like a kind of big sort of visible sign that I was really going to do something of the stereotype. So I had my big sort of black cat, who I love more than anything, called Bruno, who was sort of waddling around, and Mum was going, oh, isn't Bruno lovely? And I said, Mum, I want to tell you something. And I can remember my mum sitting there, and she visibly shrunk into the sofa. She sort of went like this, and colour drained from her face, and she said 3 things. She said, you'll never know the joy of having grandchildren. Oh, I don't know why I've said that. Oh, and she was really struggling with everything. And secondly, what she really meant was don't die of AIDS. And then the third thing she said, but I'll always support you. And I can remember that third thing. I was so devastated by the first two comments, but the third comment just effaced all of those other ones.
I was really lucky in a sense because I don't really have a coming out story because I never came out. I never had to have that conversation with my mum, with my friends. It wasn't something that was ever really kind of talked about. Not in a negative way, not in a I can't tell my friends, my family. But it was just something that we never really needed to talk about. And it wasn't really until I came to kind of university that I realised that I just didn't have the language to have that conversation. And again, that wasn't a negative thing. It wasn't a bad thing that I didn't know how to talk about it. It was just because I'd never had to. My mum was always kind of, from when I was really young, was always really accepting of who I was, regardless of who I loved, what I did with my life, where I ended up in 10 years' time. And it just kind of was all rolled into me being really aware that my mum loved me no matter what my decisions were. So I feel really lucky that I've never had to sit down and have that really scary conversation where I don't know how to tell someone kind of about my sexual orientation or kind of who I fall in love with, because it was never something that I had to do.
The interesting thing about coming out is you probably never stop doing it, because every time that you meet somebody new, or every time you start a new job, or you meet new friends, or you meet a new partner of a new friend or something like that, you kind of have to come out all the time because people don't automatically know that you're gay. And sometimes that's easier than others, I think. So if you have a partner, it's quite easy to say, oh, this is my girlfriend, and generally people kind of work it out. However, if you're not in a relationship, sometimes that can be, you do actually have to mention it to people. But I think the very, very first time that you ever tell anyone is probably quite an emotional time for most people. For me, it was quite amusing. I was at school. I think I was doing my A-level French, so I'd have been about 16, 17. And I was sitting next to my friend Hannah in our history class. And Hannah actually wasn't a particularly good friend of mine. We weren't particularly close. We sat together in history. I always thought she was quite cool. But we were writing notes, and she'd written me a note and said, oh, is there anybody that you fancy at the moment? And I was thinking, oh no, this is like really awkward. I don't know what to say. So I wrote back to her and said, just in this note, meanwhile we're learning about kind of like, the Nazi occupation of Poland, which is probably what we should have been concentrating on. But I wrote back to her and sort of said, oh, there is somebody. And she'd written back and said, oh, tell me who. And it was actually my English teacher at the time, who was female, and I didn't really want to tell her that. So for the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, we had this ridiculous exchanging of notes where I was just avoiding the question. And in the end, she just said to me, oh, just tell me who it is, I really want to know. So I wrote her a note back saying, what if the person that I like isn't male? And she wrote me the best note back. She just wrote back and said, I just want to know who it is, just tell me who it is. And that was an amazing experience. And that was pretty much the first person I ever told. And it just wasn't a big deal afterwards. We just had a bit of a laugh about it. And then she teased me forevermore in English.
It was a really positive thing because it gave me the support of my dad that I hadn't had previously. And he was initially supportive, but it still took quite a lot of work. So I used to send newspaper cuttings in the post to him and various other things. I remember him once saying that a friend of his had this conversation on the phone where he'd said something like, homosexuals, they need to rot in hell. And my dad had his own little coming out moment and said, don't you say that, my daughter's a lesbian, and slammed the phone down on him. So it's also other people's coming out stories as well as your own, because it impacts on other people's lives as well as your own life.
It's not a big deal, and I certainly think kind of generationally, if that's even a word, it's something that is definitely changing. Kind of people my age, people younger than me, tend to not necessarily need to have those conversations because it's become so kind of ingrained that this is a normal thing, and it's just become so normalised that people fall in love with whoever they want, whether they're male, female, gender confused, gender queer, whatever they are, that it's much easier, I think, now to come out because you don't have to have those really terrifying conversations that you might have had to have kind of previously.
I think when it's something that's so intrinsic to who you are, to lay that bare and to say to people, this is who I am, and then for people to turn around and reject you because of that, I think that is a huge thing for a lot of people. So I think the reason why it's such a positive thing to do and why it's probably the best decision anyone can make is because it kind of frees you of that fear of what will people think. And actually it's much easier to deal with the reality of what people think, even if it's negative. Because if people have a negative reaction to you coming out, it puts you in a place where you can say, well, it really is your problem and not mine. I'm really comfortable with who I am. And if you don't accept it, then really that's your issue. Whereas when you keep it a secret and you don't talk about it, I think you start to question yourself and you feel there might be something to be ashamed of. So I do think it's probably the most liberating thing you can do.
So I think my message to people coming out is you can't predict how people respond, but everybody will, the people that you want to accept you will accept you. And the weight, it was like a physical weight being removed from my shoulders, just feeling comfortable in my own skin. And then, of course, this great long list of all these friends of mine who were going to desert me. Well, it was, the one or two who weren't impressed. Well, in the end, I wasn't that fussed. And everybody else was just amazing. My sister summed it up, so what? And I've known for years. I was like, oh God, I thought I'd covered it up. What do you mean you've known for years? Well, I used to play football. How can you say you've known? All that kind of ridiculous sort of stuff. And I've just always felt in my career and in my sort of, own life, being honest to yourself is just the most important thing that you can do. And if there's one thing that I'd really like to achieve at DMU, with this DMU Pride, is that one person feels confident enough to be able to say, actually, this is who I am. And that would be the ultimate success for me.